Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about the Second World War, looking at the Eastern Front. So this video will be about the Battle of Stalingrad, by some reckoning the most significant battle of all time. So the Third Reich was experiencing ever greater problems with its oil supplies, because obviously the Soviet Union wasn't selling them oil. It was getting oil from Romania. Its oil supply from Libya, the Italian colony, was constantly harassed by the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy and so on, and more fuel was used getting tanks, getting trucks to the Eastern Front as it had moved further, and the partisans, they were disrupting supplies with increasing frequency. So Allied bombing of Romanian oil installations meant the supplies were not dependable. Ploiești and Pitești were two of the major oil towns in Romania, and they're being hammered by the US Army Air Corps in particular. Incidentally, the US Air Force as such didn't exist until 1948. The Air Corps was part of the Army prior to that. The fuel situation for the Third Reich was ever more precarious. Hitler ordered his troops to turn south into the Caucasus towards Azerbaijan, which was a center of oil production in the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan only became the major oil-producing republic of the Soviet Union from the 1950s onwards, and Hitler indeed had a cake for himself baked in the shape of the Caspian Sea, because he believed his troops would soon be washing their boots in the warm waters of the Caspian. The Wehrmacht took Chechnya and came close to Azerbaijan. The RAF, way back in 1939, had even considered hammering Baku. It's the capital of Azerbaijan, the center of oil production there. And if they'd pummeled it, then that would have severely damaged Soviet oil production and therefore cut off oil supplies to Germany in 1939. And it wasn't to be. Just like in 1918, Azerbaijan seemed to be the goal of both sides. The Wehrmacht took Chechnya. They approached the frontiers of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. The German troops found some time to send a platoon up Mount Elbrus, the tallest mountain in Europe, if Europe is properly defined. Europe as far east as the Urals. And it was filmed, this occasion, conquering the summit of Elbrus and planting the Nazi banner thereupon. Anyway, the Wehrmacht was very overstretched in the Caucasus. The mountains were difficult to attack and easy to defend. The Wehrmacht was being hit in the rear. The supply lines were struggling. So in order to shorten the supply lines, it was decided they must take the city of Stalingrad. This had been one of Hitler's original objectives, but as the attack had stalled in late 1941, they had not seized Stalingrad. Moreover, it was a city with Stalin's name on it, formerly Tsaritsyn. And Stalin, being the commander there in the Russian Civil War, had been willing to put many white prisoners to death. A train of food due for Baku, for the Red Army garrison Baku, had passed through Tsaritsyn in the Russian Civil War, and Stalin was well aware that the people of Baku were absolutely starving. Nevertheless, he commandeered the train and he took the rations for his own men, leaving people in Baku to die of starvation. And Stalin had the chronicles of the Russian Civil War written to show that the Battle of Stalingrad, or Tsaritsyn rather, in the Russian Civil War had been pivotal. It's now called Volgograd. Anyway, so Hitler was fixated with Stalingrad, and not just for bearing the name of his nemesis. It was of immense strategic import. It sat astride the Volga's mighty flood. So think of the river as a means of transport more than a barrier, because there was a lot of riverine transport going up and down it, because the roads weren't that good, and there were railways, but they were increasingly being destroyed by bridges and so on, destroyed by German bombers. You can't destroy a river. It would have dealt the Soviets a shattering psychological blow to know that Stalingrad had fallen into enemy hands. They would have cut off some Soviet supplies up and down the river. It would have made the German supply lines easier. Now, admittedly, for at least 4 months of the year, it's frozen. When the ice is very solid, you can drive trucks over it. Anyway, the Wehrmacht wanted to score a decisive victory there. And then the Soviets might conclude that the Germans really had won. Stalingrad was also a major industrial center. And if you captured the city, if you had the bridges, or were able to rebuild them, then you could go deeper east as well. It was a gateway to the south. So with Stalingrad in German hands, the Wehrmacht were able to ship supplies down the Volga towards their troops in the Caucasus. Now the Volga doesn't go all the way to the Caucasus. It goes out into the north of the Caspian Sea at Astrakhan. Stalingrad would also allow the Germans to advance north of the Volga Valley towards Kazan, towards Lenin's hometown of Simbirsk, or was then known as Ulyanovsk. Anyway, so it was perhaps a foolish plan, because the Wehrmacht had little riverine transport with which to take advantage of the Volga if they captured it. Not many boats, and the Soviets were obviously going to destroy their boats rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The Germans could have built some. Soviet propaganda had underplayed enemy success and exaggerated their own. Everyone did that. The Soviet authorities did not want their people growing despondent and giving up. They wanted to put heart into their people. They would announce that the enemy had attacked in the direction of Smolensk, which meant that Smolensk had already fallen into enemy hands. The Third Reich announced victories prematurely as well. As the Wehrmacht approached Stalingrad, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, he declared in the German media that the city had already been taken. Churchill did the same thing, and he was speaking to some Royal Naval Admiral about sinking U-boats. He said, we both sink U-boats, you sink them in the sea and I sink them in the House of Commons. The trouble is I sink them at twice the rate that you do. So they had to keep public spirits up. The thing is, if one lies on too grand a scale, then people smell a rat, and they will no longer credit what you're saying, even when you speak the truth. So General Paulus was the German commander at Stalingrad. He was leading the 6th Army. He'd fought his way into Stalingrad in late 1942, but he never captured the whole city. The vortex of the fighting was the tractor factory, and they're here with great fanfare. Tractors have been produced for the first time about 10 years earlier. There have been many mishaps along the way. Anyway, Red Army troops were taken by boat across the Volga to reinforce their toehold on the west bank. They mustn't let the west bank of the Volga fall entirely into German hands. Soviet troops were required to display suicidal bravery. Life expectancy for men on the west bank was less than 24 hours. The city centre changed hands constantly, and there was house-to-house fighting. And the crucial thing was to secure the staircase, but you'll rush into a building. These are often multi-storey buildings, that's Soviet-style architecture, and the enemy are firing down at you, dropping grenades on it, not at you, but obviously you want to fire up at them. Set fire to the buildings deliberately, because the enemy, well, they can die in the smoke, or they can come down and get shot. It's not a choice many would covet. Paulus noticed that the Soviets were massing troops in his flanks. Paulus had Hungarian and Romanian soldiers on his flanks. These tend to be lightly armed, as in they had not much artillery, very few tanks, tended to have older rifles, very few machine guns, not even very much ammunition or very many grenades. Being less industrialized, these countries couldn't produce so many weapons. So Paulus had them there because it was such heavy fighting in the city centre that they needed all the firepower they could get there. And there were communication problems if you mixed, say, Romanian and German units or Hungarian and German units, because, okay, the Hungarian officers could all speak German, some of the Romanian ones too, but the ordinary men couldn't, and orders might not get down to them. There could be some confusion, friendly fire incidents when people didn't know who was what. So Paulus requested Hitler's permission to make a tactical withdrawal, and Hitler, as always, rejected this demand to retreat. Hitler had no training as military leader. He'd risen to the rank of corporal, and this promotion was meant that he didn't really understand the significance of this new military situation. He was into position warfare, remembering the Western Front, trench warfare, or even 100 meters was important, to never concede ground. Even in the First World War, German commanders had sometimes retreated because they were shortening their line or they had better defences somewhere. But Hitler didn't have that strategic vision. So Hitler went against the expert advice. All through the 30s, he'd been rejecting expert advice. He thought that his generals were institutionally cowardly. They were too circumspect. They needed to be a bit more audacious. He'd been daring, and his audacity had been crowned with the most splendid success time and again in the 30s, and for the first couple of years in the 40s. Paulus was told, no, you must stay put. You will not give an inch. So Paulus feared that the Romanians and the Hungarians would be driven back, and indeed his anxious fears transpired to be well placed. his allies were pushed back, and this allowed the Red Army to encircle the Sixth Army in Operation Uranus. The Sixth Army would try to break out, but was too weak and was heavily outnumbered, and the Soviets were bringing in more and more reinforcements. Once the Sixth Army was enveloped, it was only a matter of time before it could succumb. Air Marshal Hermann Göring vowed to Hitler that he could keep Paulus's men supplied by air. So they were landing at the airfield as fast as they could to bring in food, munitions, to bring in, to take out wounded men, not bringing in reinforcements significantly. Some level, perhaps even Hitler realised this was a forlorn hope. So the Sixth Army was running very low on fuel in the middle of a bitter Soviet winter. Food was in desperately short supply, and ammunition was not plentiful. So the Luftwaffe was being shot down by the Red Air Force and indeed Soviet and anti-aircraft guns. So it really wasn't worth it for the Luftwaffe to do this, and the Soviets were coming closer and closer to the runway, bombarding it. There were shell craters in the runway, and the Germans were not able to repair them on time. So the Red Army's doctrine was that artillery was highly important. It's one of the reasons they moved slowly. They wouldn't go further forward without their artillery. Too often this was an encumbrance. It slowed them in both in advance and in retreat, and occasionally they had to abandon it. For once this closed-minded belief that the infantry mustn't go with artillery paid off, and the Germans were being really hammered. They didn't have much artillery, and they couldn't maneuver out of there. Speed was the essence of German military doctrine, and here speed couldn't be used because there was nowhere to move to. So Stalingrad became static fighting, and the Soviet predilection for big guns began to pay off heavily. The Red Army attacked ferociously and valorously on all sides, and the fighting went from house to house. So in the stairwell, well, that was the killing zone, and so many buildings became a charnel house. In January 1942, General K.K. Rokossovsky offered Paulus generous terms of surrender. His men would be given normal Soviet rations, and the sick and wounded would be given medical treatment. Because the Soviets had scarcely enough food for their own men, they certainly didn't have a lot of food to spare for their deadly enemies, who'd committed many atrocities against Soviet civilians. There was, of course, no reason to think these promises would not be reneged on later, and what were you going to do if they were? General Paulus rejected the offer of lenient treatment twice. Paulus's resolve is hard to credit as a soldier, if not as a human being. Finally, the situation was absolutely hopeless for the Axis. In February 1943, the battered Sixth Army was on the point of being overrun. The men who remained alive, half of them were wounded. Not all of them were walking wounded either. Some of the better connected ones managed to be evacuated. The airfield was stormed and wounded men could not be got out. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the last man and the last round of ammunition. Just before the Red Army was about to administer the coup de grâce, Hitler radioed that Paulus had been promoted Field Marshal. Now, no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, and so some people say that Hitler was tacitly signalling to Paulus that he must take his own life rather than be shameful and capitulate. However, Paulus said he was a sincere Christian and suicide was a mortal sin. Therefore, he surrendered to the enemy. 250,000 German soldiers had entered the city. Only 100,000 lived to surrender. Many of them succumbed to wounds shortly thereafter. The German soldiers were marched off into captivity, which was not cosy. The column of ragged prisoners was filmed by Soviet propaganda, snaking off towards the horizon. Only 6,000 survived the war. Think about that. 250,000 entered the city, only 6,000 survived the war. Paulus was induced to broadcast anti-Nazi messages on Soviet radio to disseminate defeatism in the Third Reich. Paulus was very cooperative with the Soviets, and he later became a historian in the German Democratic Republic. That's Communist East Germany, a police inspector, and he lived in great comfort to the end of his life in the 1950s.